Welcome back to the program. Joining me, as he does every week, is former commando, now Liberal MP Keith Wolahan. It was a poignant day, as it always is in many respects, ANZAC Day yesterday. How did you spend it, Keith?
Oh, thank you, Kieran. I spent it at the dawn service in Doncaster and then moved through to a service at Templestowe and Warrandyte. And those services were throughout the nation. And one of the things I noted was that when the memorial I was at was first unveiled, then Brigadier Pompey Elliott spoke. He spoke at that memorial in 1921, a mere 6 years after the landing at Gallipoli. And it was only 10 years later that he took his own life. And I thought it was important yesterday to acknowledge that the loss that our nation has suffered over many wars is an overflowing MCG of young men. And I made that point yesterday, that the scale of the loss for our nation is almost too hard for a human brain to comprehend. So I took them to the centre of that ground and imagined that they were there and what we would say when we say, lest we forget.
Indeed, and it's a wonderful part of who we are, though, isn't it? The fact that there is a growing recognition, I think, in many respects. And talking to Matt Anderson, the director of the War Memorial yesterday, the numbers of young people showing up at the dawn service and the marches, it's something we need to foster. It's an important part of the fabric of who we are, isn't it?
It is, and I read the address that Pompey Elliott gave in 1921, and one of the things he said was, I hope that the legacy of what they did is remembered. And if he was standing there with me 103 years later, it would have taken his breath away when he looked out over the Doncaster RSL and saw over 3,000 people standing there in the cold and the dark, including young children, their parents and their grandparents. It was quite moving.
Yeah, and as you rightly pointed out, and that was the scene that we saw right around the country, from Coogee to Doncaster, and I know the CBDs of all our major cities. It is an important part of our country and our yearly schedule. It's the number one day in my view. Now let's look at the mental health question. We saw Scott Morrison put this on the radar today, very frank and upfront about his own challenges when he was in the top job.
Yeah, I read that with interest today too, and I think that took a lot of courage for him to be frank and open about that. There is, whatever your political persuasions are, we can all agree that the office of Prime Minister is one of the toughest jobs in this country, would have enormous stress on any Prime Minister. And for him to say through that period, particularly the stressful period of COVID, that he needed help, and he sought it, he was given that help, and he still functioned as our Prime Minister. And that says that if that office is one where you can function having sought help, then anyone in any position throughout our nation can do the same.
Indeed, and a good example, Keith Wolahan, as well to others, that it's not something to hide away from, that people need to be upfront about it. If treatment or medication is needed, then so be it.
That's right. And again, people will have issue about decisions that are made from a partisan perspective. But Scott Morrison made some phenomenal decisions for our nation under enormous stress, and he did so while he was seeking help. So anyone can.
On to a few other matters. The scourge of domestic violence, the numbers of women losing their lives I was going to say on a weekly basis, but the most recent data says every 4 days a woman has been killed by a partner or ex-partner. This is horrific.
It is. Not long ago, I went and spoke to all of the police stations in my electorate because there's a particular surge of violent crime, and we saw a young man was killed in a home invasion here in Doncaster, where my office is. But what struck me when I visited the police stations was that very rarely did I visit and not see children with their bags packed because the police are helping with a domestic violence incident. And that's heartbreaking. And at the most extreme level, we are seeing young women, girlfriends and mums losing their lives to people who have a propensity to violence. And there is something wrong in our criminal justice system at the moment, and we need to have a look at that.
We do indeed. And finally, on the economic front, we're seeing obviously cost of living pressures causing dramas for a lot of people. And then the rate forecasts, our regular expert on this program, Warren Hogan from Judo Bank, he thinks there could be 3 rate rises now, not cuts, hikes, 3 hikes by the end of the year.
Look, for the good of our nation and for families who are struggling, I hope he's wrong. But what it says is that inflation is sticky, and that if this government doesn't do the heavy lifting, particularly in this budget that's coming up, well, then the RBA will do it for them. And that's not in our national interest, and that will send some families to the wall.
Keith Wallahan, thank you as always. We'll catch you next week.
Thank you, Kieran.